Friends, comrades, compatriots, I'm Jackie Fox, and I'm not always the most attentive member of my local DSA, but when I do show up, I try to take in some high-level ideas and bring them back to my audience. And this time, I brought back an hour-long lecture on Introduction to Socialism. We're going to start with Marx and then work it up past Marx into post-Marxist Marxism, or postmodern postmodernism, or postmodern Marxism, post-capitalism world words, and I'm just going to cut to the video.
Liberal outlets are kind of forced to do, what about Karl Marx stuff, The Economist, so on. Okay, so Karl Marx had kind of a typical petty bourgeois childhood. Was born in Trier, same age as Frederick Douglass. He came from a Jewish family of rabbis that had been Christianized. His father was like a liberal constitutionalist, and his mother was from a fairly prosperous family that went on to make Philips Electronics. So Lenin said in 1913 that Marxism is a legitimate successor of the best that man produced in the 19th century as presented by German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism. And so I want to touch on each of those things as a component of what would be later Marxism. Marx dropped out of college. He had a bad go at it early on because of did quite a bit of drinking and fighting and these sorts of things. And as you can tell, his didn't look so great on the left. That was during his fighting years. That's actually a portrait, not a drawing. That's how bad he was doing. And then you see on the right, he was looking much better as he went back to school at University of Berlin. Can't remember. It's wherever Hegel was. And so he studied under George Friedrich Hegel, or at least studied Hegel's philosophy, which is, I don't know, some people put a lot of credit into Hegel's hands. I don't know, I'm not a Hegelian. I mostly find it to be kind of boring junk, but there's one really important part of Hegel, which is the dialectic, which often gets kind of simplified as being a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So, say someone says, oh, there is a God, and then someone says, well, in fact, there's not, and the synthesis will be some kind of deism or something. And Hegel's idea is that this is an idealist an idealist progression throughout history, that history improves because we're each having these new ideas which then get kind of tossed into the bouncy pit of ideas, and the best ones kind of appear. And this was very influential for Marx. I think what's most important to note is that synthesis and antithesis and thesis are not quite the German. The German is Aufhebung, which is really important because it means to both abolish and sublate and transform and transcend. So it's sort of like you can get suspended from school and that you're not coming, but you can also get in suspended air, which means you're kind of frozen. So it's this word that has a lot more meaning than just the synthesis, which is really important for Marx, and it's important for his conception of what the world will be after capitalism. So that's it for German. There's more German beer. So Marx famously flips Hegel on his head, which is to say that though Hegel is an idealist and believes in the world of ideas kind of being the motor of history and creating a kind of teleological kind of utopia through this, Marx says actually it's material, not immaterial things. And so Marx talks about the material parts of the world, social relations, labor, the means of production, and these are the driving forces of history, and that in fact the ideas are born of these more material aspects of human social construction. And so this kind of leads Marx into theorizing about alienation. In his early economic work, the Philosophical and Economic Manuscripts of 1844, he's just kind of getting started with thinking about economy through kind of Hegelian philosophy. And so what's big for Marx coming from talking about alienation, just kind of a popular idea. What's you kind of have to understand, I guess, is that Marx is sort of still existing on the kind of very beginning of industrial capitalism. So the world that we all kind of live in, the water in which we are all fish, was just really blossoming during Marx's time, and it was very much far away from being the kind of global norm. So for Marx, the new striking kind of part of capitalism was that you don't own the products which you make. So if Megan was a craftsman and she made shoes, for instance, adjacent to her house, then when Megan makes a shoe, it's hers to sell, and Megan gets the entirety of that profit. But now Megan works at a big factory in which tons of shoes are made, and the productivity is much higher. But when the shoe is made, it is no longer Megan's. In fact, Megan might just be doing one small part of the shoemaking process, and it's certainly not hers. In fact, she's paid a wage which is less than the value which is within the shoe itself. And so this is kind of what Marx is seeing. He's seeing that whereas, if you were, again, a craftsman or whatever, or an artisan or a small proprietor, you would own your means of production, however measly they are. But the new class, the proletariat, is without property entirely. The only thing they own is their labor power. And the necessities of life are also now on the market. So you're not satisfying your needs through the domestic, the makeshift economy of a domestic sphere. You're now on the market. Some of these things are an improvement, by the way. I mean, I think it's easy to talk about these things only negatively. It's good that people are no longer peasants, for the most part. So, again, good and bad. And this is kind of, we'll get into this more. This is definitely what Marx thinks as well. So you get two different classes. You get, obviously, your owning class, your bourgeoisie, and all of the hucksters that they surround themselves with, and you get the proletariat, which is the working class. And it's like this one. So the promise initially, of course, even in the kind of collective conscious of being an American, is that if you work hard enough, you'll become a member of the bourgeoisie, which is just patently false. I mean, if it was true, mules would be billionaires. So, Okay, so and then there's a little updated version of, social structure, order of society, so on. Okay, so that's German shit. Now we're getting to some French shit. Marx obviously was not the first socialist. Socialism as an idea had been around for a while. But the original socialists are pretty hit or miss. So like Charles Fourier said that, once we enter socialism, the rivers will run of lemonade and so on. And some were less stupid. I mean, Robert Owen is certainly less stupid. But a lot of them didn't envision a world past the factory which they owned. Will, do you have a comment on Robert Owen?
I don't know. It's funny to me that Charles Fourier was such a phenomenal mathematician.
Yeah.
His political ideas were so bizarre.
Yes. You don't know what's going on with him. Not regarding his lemonade stuff. I think he might have been gotten into the king's wine house or something. But Marx, the primary thing is that Marx sees this type of socialism as utopian. He proposes a scientific socialism. So scientific socialism, somewhat based on, of course, the Enlightenment, rationalization, all this stuff. Charles Darwin, which Marx was very influenced by, and actually sent a copy of Das Kapital to Darwin. There's no evidence that he read it, but he did respond saying, "Thank you for sending me your book." Scientific socialism, very important, and Republicanism, which is a kind of easy to forget about part of socialism in the 19th century, but it's something that I think is extremely essential. And one of the reasons Marx didn't write about it that much is that it was, again, kind of the water that they swam in. If you were a radical, you were a Republican. And I don't mean that in the Lindsey Graham fucking way, like Republican small r. But yeah, this is a pretty big thing. Universal human rights, civic virtue and responsibility, no duties without rights, no rights without duties. Thomas Paine is probably the best American Republican. considering he's the only one who didn't own slaves. But mostly the French Republicans are the kind of like archetype, Robespierre, so on. So, 1848, Republican revolutions are unleashed across Europe. There's all the countries, a bunch of them. Marx kind of jumped ship. Engels actually did some fighting, which is kind of cool. 1848 is also the year that the Communist Manifesto was written, which is obviously workers of the world unite, so on and so forth. But it had no effect on the 1848 revolutions at all. It just kind of happened to happen at the same time. In England, or not in England, but in Germany, or it would be Prussia at the time, August Willich was a communist general who was one of the revolutionaries that Engels served under, and would later serve under Abraham Lincoln in the U.S. Army during the American Civil War. And in fact, there were a lot of German emigres from 1848 into the United States, including nearly Marx himself, who was going to move to Texas for a while. And we know that because there are papers that were, whatever, to his local consulate that apparently he was looking into moving to Texas, which is very funny. But one of the things that the Communist Manifesto mentions is the kind of impending globalization of capitalism because of the internal contradictions of capitalism itself. It craves new markets, it craves accumulation and kind of endless exploitation. It's one of the reasons we're having basically a planetary crisis as we speak. But Marx read this within the logic of capitalism itself so early on, which is one of the kind of his many kind of prophetic moments. Also, Marx, interestingly enough, wrote quite frequently for the New York Tribune, which was owned by Horace Greeley, a very, very close friend of Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln's Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, was Marx's employer. Actually, probably the longest running employer of Marx and Engels in their journalistic careers. So, Marx was, I wouldn't say foundational within the creation of the Republican Party, but he was an early figure in the Republican Party, which is absolutely batshit to think about. But if you were in the higher ups of the Republican Party, you would have probably read Marx in the New York Tribune. Almost difficult to fathom. But the American Communist Party never forgot it, and they certainly have kind of lots of, especially kind of homages to Lincoln. And Lincoln was much more kind of socialistic in his time than would be expected. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. I mean, I don't even think Sanders would say that. I mean, it's like it's like a real punch in the face. But there you go. And that was kind of the world that they were in. Charles Dana once said that we're all socialists now, which is just absolutely insane. But it didn't really last long. I mean, the Republican Party kind of grew up and definitely made its ties with the bourgeoisie sooner than later. So yeah, there you go. And this was during the kind of Browderism period of the Communist Party, U.S. Communist Party. And they kind of went on this weird thing that communism is 20th century Americanism, which is completely harebrained. I mean, it doesn't really make that much sense, and it didn't really do that much for the party. But hey, it was the Popular Front, and everybody was trying to make good with liberals, so there you go. Okay, English political economy. This is the last wing of Marxism, and one of the most important parts. This is where Marx really kind of cuts his teeth. So, Das Kapital, it took like 2 decades of work, and within it is Marx's kind of full exploration of the labor theory of value, or his version of it. And there are earlier ones from Adam Smith and Ricardo. Even Benjamin Franklin shows up within Das Kapital. And there's 3 volumes altogether. Karl Kautsky edited a 4th a little later on, I think, called Theories of Surplus Value or something. And Engels edited the last 2. But this is really the magnum opus for Marx. And here is one of David Harvey's kind of graphs showing the capitalist production and consumption process. If you're not familiar with David Harvey, he's a really great Marxist economist that is definitely good to get into. So Marx, within Das Kapital and the following 2 volumes, shows a lot of, again, kind of prophetic stuff. One is the falling rate of profit, which even a lot of bourgeois economists had to concede is a accurate portrayal, at least in the West, of the inability to be competitive after. It's kind of a difficult thing to describe, but falling rate of profit. Michael Roberts writes about this a bit, and economic crashes Marx talks about quite a bit as well. So, capitalism to socialism. So, Marx's idea is that capitalism gives us the opportunity to produce abundance for all in a way that feudalism could not. But capitalism also, within its internal logic, has no desire to produce total abundance for all because it's unprofitable to do so. And so you have kind of artificial scarcity and so on. So Marx basically, socialism to some extent is the shadow of capitalism's possibilities. Capitalism only produces abundance where profitable, and socialism, the goal is to use the tools of capitalism for common wealth. So the means of production would then be run cooperatively according to a democratic plan, and no one's life would become worse as technology and our ability to make things improves, which is kind of what we're seeing, especially within the United States and England, is kind of mass austerity, even as we stand every day on the kind of pinnacle of technological innovation and productivity. And it seems that in a lot of ways, a lot of people's lives have only gotten worse. This is kind of unacceptable. So, kind of pivoting to Russia slowly, Marx had this dialogue with Boris Asulich, who's in the Narodnik movement, sort of like a Russian semi-peasant anarchist kind of movement. And she writes to Marx saying that the Mir, which is the Russian peasant village, that the Mir kind of has a socialistic collective spirit, and could this be the basis of socialism? And Marx actually learns Russian and does a lot of studying of the Russian economy and so on. And his basic conclusion is that no, that Russia is too premature for a socialist revolution. You can read the response. It's really interesting. But basically, Marx says you got to have capitalism before you have socialism. Is kind of his thing. Okay. Yeah, that's his response. Okay, so looking at the Paris Commune, first socialist revolution, very influential for Marx's conception of the state. The Paris Commune had very few Marxists in it, mostly Blanquists and Neo-Jacobins, and they got fucked pretty hard by both the French and Prussian armies. As you can very well see, they're just kind of, they got screwed over pretty bad. But this is the first socialist revolution. This is very important because Marx bases his conception of the state after the Paris Commune and the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which isn't as bad as you think. It's based on the idea. Dictatorship kind of just meant regime then, or the dictation of. And Marx kind of conceived the dictatorship of the proletariat as a democratic republican body that would work continuously and that would be entirely in the control of the working class. No bourgeoisie allowed, and it can kind of better be understood by us currently living within the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which, if you think about it, is very much the case. All of our politicians are bourgeois. Their children study at private institutions and get unpaid internships for however long, and then they end up stocking the think tanks which write our policies. We do essentially live in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So, Marx from this conceives of a commune state, which is kind of libertarian almost idea, I use that in quotes, but it's certainly not a party state. And Yeah, so Marx says the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. That the state has to be smashed, the bourgeois state has to be smashed. Lenin in State and Revolution kind of resuscitates this idea, which had been kind of, not I would say kind of buried, or had been somewhat kind of played off by the German Social Democrats. So Lenin says, the commune therefore appears to have replaced the smashed state machine only by fuller democracy, abolition of the standing army, all officials to be elected and subject to recall. But as a matter of fact, this only signifies a gigantic replacement of certain institutions by other institutions of a fundamentally different type. This is exactly the case of quantity being transformed into quality. Democracy, introduced as fully and consistently as is at all conceivable, is transformed from bourgeois into proletarian democracy, from the state, a special force for the suppression of a particular class, into something which is no longer a state proper. So, everybody kind of generally believes that Lenin is the first kind of statist, Marxist kind of authoritarian. This is very much not the case. Lenin is kind of has a almost was almost closer to anarchism in a way, but this is his idea. I mean, obviously it fails, and we'll talk about that. But this is the initial idea of the communist state. And so you'd have municipal councillors chosen by universal suffrage. In the various wards of the town, responsible and irrevocable at short terms. The majority of its members were naturally workers, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The commune was to be a working, not parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. So you also collapse the checks and balances division to power. That is something that Marx kind of conceived of as being an expedient. It would end up being a huge fucking problem within the Soviet Union. Obviously, I mean, checks and balances are generally pretty good. So that's another thing, a little bit of a red flag.
Fox Talks.
All the way to post-Marxist Marxism, post-markets, and most certainly post-modern, Postmates delivery service, post-rational thought.